Unfortunately, I'm going to have to stay here because I can't hold the mic and do my things very easily. Yeah, some people say that they have a sports-related injury, and it feels like, you know, it's very impressive with a sports-related injury. Well, yes, but I've got a hotel-related injury, so I think that's slightly different. It's not so impressive, is it? I want to make a point about this later, that the injury is to do with design. And design is going to be one of the features that I want to talk about in the context of feedback. In the way that bad hotel design leads to injuries, bad feedback design leads to educational injuries. So let's return to that later when I've set the scene a little. What I'd like to do is I have a presentation, obviously. Do feel free to interrupt, to ask questions, to raise points as we go through. If I'm also speaking too fast, then just tell me to slow down. I'm the kind of person that responds well to interruptions, and I don't respond well to not being interrupted. I'll continue to go on and bore you if you don't interrupt. Okay, well, feedback is our topic for this morning. And feedback, I want to suggest, is important for many, many more reasons than you might think. I want to suggest to you that feedback is a much more important, a much more significant event in the experience of students and in their preparation for their future lives than just giving them useful information about their work. That's the easy bit. That's the trivial bit. The more important things are the things I want to focus on. So this is the where I want to take us. I want to raise a question about what we're preparing students for, and clearly we're preparing them for a world that is changing very rapidly. And we're preparing them for a world that we do not know and is unknowable to us and to them. So when we're designing our courses, we need to think about issues like feedback in terms of, well, is it just about correction? Well, we're correcting things that we know maybe they're not going to do. So how do we think about feedback in the context where we're providing helpful information for things that we don't know about? The other thing I want to raise, the other question I want to raise here is, how do we know that we're doing well in feedback? Do we all know exactly what the effect is on our students of the comments that we make about their work? Do we know that? If the answer is we're not sure, why are we doing it? The only reason for us to spend time and effort on acts of feedback is because it makes a difference. And we need to know what the difference is. Otherwise, how do we know what to say? How do we know how to say it? How do we actually make a contribution for students' learning in the long term? So I want to move on from this to a bigger focus on shifting feedback ideas. What we've seen over the last 10 years or so, internationally, is a move from the idea that feedback is an input that we as teachers make to students, to seeing feedback as a process that necessarily involves them, not desirably involves them, necessarily requires their involvement, because otherwise, what are we doing it for? And that's a big conceptual shift, and I want to lead you through some of the ideas behind that. I want to also briefly introduce you to the idea of developing students' evaluative judgment. And that's the idea of, can students judge their own work? Because when we graduate our students, they're going into a working context in which the assumption is, by their employers, that they know what they know and they know what they don't know. How well are we preparing our students for that? Because in the normal workplace, nobody is continually telling you, oh, you've got that right, you've not got that right, you need to change that. That might happen in the first few days or for a few weeks, but it doesn't last very long. And if we rely on our line manager to give us feedback, we will not keep our job for very long. We are unemployable if we don't have the skills. So I want to introduce the idea of evaluative judgment and where feedback fits into that. And then the final thing I want to introduce you to is the kind of what you might call the cutting edge of our research within my centre in Deakin, and that is to explore the notion of students' feedback literacy. Students can only utilise feedback if they understand what it is. I don't mean the comments you make, of course they need to understand those, but what feedback is, how does it operate, how can they utilise feedback for their own ends, for their own learning purposes. So I want to unpack that notion of feedback literacy. So that's the trajectory, that's the pathway that we're going down. We had a project, a big national project in Australia about feedback. And one of the things we did for one of our workshops, we employed a cartoonist. And he came along to represent in cartoon forms some of the ideas we were talking about. And this was his representation of old ideas about feedback. So I've got the teacher here firing a cannon at the students, firing information. And of course, well, that's what feedback is. So, you know, you've done your job as a teacher. You've put all that information out there. It's accurate, it's true, it's appropriate. So we can go home now. We're finished. Feedback's done. So that's the old notion. So this is the project. I don't know why I've got this slide, all bits. So some of the ideas I want to draw upon are from this project. So we did a large study of 2 universities in Australia, and these are large universities. So in Australia, when we mean large, we mean more than 50,000 students. Anything other than that is small. So that's real. So we got you know, really small response rates. You know, only got 4,500 students responding. You know. And what we were interested in this feedback for learning closing the assessment group is what works when and why, and what is enabling excellent feedback. And we did a survey, we did focus groups, we got the students to identify the really best feedback experiences they had in their whole career in the university, or in the last year in the university. And then we went and tracked down exactly what the teachers were doing, exactly what they were doing. Why was it the students thought this was wonderful? And we then turned some of that into case studies, which I'll talk about later. And if you want to follow up any of this, we've got this website, feedbackforlearning.org, and a lot of the resources I'm talking about today will be found on the website. So, what's our starting point? I left feedback on their final essays, which they never collected. Is this feedback? Is it? The teacher did their job. So why are we not happy?
Because it hasn't been fed back.
Yeah. Well, no, it has been fed back. But the students haven't collected it, or they haven't read it, or... Yeah. The point is there's no engagement. So we absolutely need a notion of feedback that involves the students engaging with useful information that they receive from other people. So one of the things we did in our project is that we tried to look at some of the definitions of feedback and basically rejected a large number of them because they were related to the old conception of feedback, this one, and we had to come up with a new one. So feedback is a process. It's not an input. Inputs are involved, information giving is involved, but that's not the whole business. It's a process. And it's a process in which learners do things. So we're shifting it from a focus on what teachers do to what learners do. Now clearly, for learners to do something, teachers must have done something first. Fair enough. But it doesn't help us by focusing exclusively on what teachers do, because that doesn't necessarily in itself have the effect. So learners make sense of information about their performance, so it's about what students have done. It's about specific things that they've done. It's not general information that we're giving students. We're giving students general information all the time, but we don't call that feedback. So it's about their performance, and the students use it. They read it for starts, but they need to do something more than read it. They use it to enhance the quality of their work or learning strategies. So this is what we're suggesting is a more useful and more productive way of thinking about feedback. It's shifting the focus away from what teachers do to what students do. Clearly, teachers need to do some things to enable this to happen. That's our job. But our job doesn't end with the provision of information. Some people call it dangling data. Hopefully useful information. So the old notion is feedback is an act of faith. We put something out there, we cross our fingers, we hope something happens. No, we're in the 21st century now, we can't buy things like that. So, in terms of our cartoonists, this was our cartoonists' conception. So that the students were getting information that had some impact on their work, and it raised them to greater and greater levels of performance. Now, just stepping back a bit, we might ask ourselves, why are we worried about feedback? Why? You know, it's like, of all the things that we do in education, why is feedback worth thinking about? Well, John Hattie's done a number of studies, done a huge number of meta-analyses, and basically his argument is that most of the important things that have a direct influence on students' learning are to do with feedback. Now this is a rather old version of it. There are far newer versions of it, you can find in the literature. But Hattie has really argued very strongly that feedback is one of the few things that we do as teachers, one of the few things we do as teachers that makes a difference. There's lots of things we do which don't make a difference. We like doing them, but they don't make a difference. So let's focus on the things that do make a difference. So these are some of the things that people have traditionally experienced about feedback. I don't know whether you have it in the Netherlands, but in many countries there's a national student survey. So all the graduates are surveyed in terms of what did they like and what did they dislike about their courses. And certainly in Australia, and certainly in the UK, and certainly in some other countries that do these national surveys, what comes up as number one problem? Assessment and feedback. Number one. And it's been number one for the last 20 or 25 years. Right. Number one. We keep trying to do something about it, but it doesn't work. And one of the reasons I suggest that it doesn't work is we've got a really terrible concept of feedback. If we had a more productive concept of feedback, maybe more aligned to what students think feedback should be, we would get somewhere. But these are some of the problems. So first of all, students complain they don't get enough of it. Yeah. Then sometimes when they get enough of it, they don't look at it anyway. So can we win? Both parties see it as a bit confronting, it's challenging, you know, because we're actually confronting students with issues and problems about their own learning. And so we've got to put ourselves out there. We're moving from a safe teaching space to a risky teaching space. And for the students to engage in it is risky. Well, I'm doing okay, you know, my grades are okay, they're not wonderful, but it's okay. Feedback comes into that, and it's a challenge. We, as teachers, resent the amount of time we spend on this task. You know, the number of weekends or evenings that have been utilised or maybe wasted on this act is something that I find very disturbing. When I look back on my career as a teacher, I'm thinking earlier on in my career, the amount of time I spent commenting on students' work, and it was completely a waste of time. Completely a waste of time. What I said was true, what I said was accurate, but did it have an effect? It might have had an effect on one or two people at the margins, but it wasn't set up that way. So we've got to do something about that. And the problem is, feedback's typically telling and diagnostic in flavour, often lacking strategies for improvement. Very important distinction here is between mark justification, justifying the grade you give to a student, and feedback. They are not the same thing. Mark justification is essentially looking backwards in time. What did you do then? How well did you do it? Feedback is necessarily looking forward in time. Feedback is always about students doing something, improving their learning or their learning strategies. So it's often helpful to have this idea in your head. Yes, when I'm marking students' work, I do need to justify my grade. You know, that's a reasonable expectation. But don't think that is feedback. Feedback is doing things that help students do better next time. So, a few years ago, my colleague,
Is that what your feedback, what you call feedback, is that what we also call feed forward?
Ah, that's a very good question. In the literature, you will find this idea called feed forward. The concept of feed forward is only necessary if you don't understand feedback. If you understand feedback, it's a redundant term, because feedback necessarily has to have a feed forward effect. So let me just take an example of feedback from some other discipline. Let's pretend we're engineers. Now, one of the things in this room here is an air conditioning system. And there's a temperature detector in the back of the room, and it measures the temperature. And if the temperature gets hot, which it does at the moment, then it sends a message to the plant up there somewhere, and it says, send cold air. Okay. Cold air comes into the room, the temperature drops, and then when it's dropped to a certain level, the measuring device says, stop sending cold air. Now this is the traditional classic feedback loop in engineering. In education, we've borrowed the concept of feedback from engineering, the biological sciences and other things. And when we've borrowed that concept, we've actually forgotten bits, we've left bits off. And just think about the comparison between the air conditioning system and what we do with students in terms of feedback. Now, is the message that the temperature device sends to the plant saying send cold air, is that feedback? Is it? There's no engineer that will tell you, it will say it's feedback. Not feedback at all. It's part of a feedback process, but in itself, it is not feedback. We can only detect that feedback has occurred when there's a response that can be detected by the measuring system that detected the temperature in the first place. So it's only when the loop is completed, it's only when the temperature of the room drops, that we can say that feedback has occurred. So feedback is necessarily, taking the engineering analogy, about changing the future. It's about changing the state or the temperature of the room. So we don't need another concept called feed forward. It's just redundant. You could say, well, it has an effect of, improving students' work, but we only need the word feed forward if we've got a bad conception of feedback. And I want you to end this morning's session with having a really good conception of feedback. That's the idea. Good, thank you for that question. That was a very helpful one. So, where were we? Oh, Mark Zero, yeah. So Liz Malloy and myself developed this little schema. So we looked historically at what was going on in feedback. And we identified there are a number of different generations of thinking about feedback. And the first one is we called feedback Mark Zero. And I'll explain in a moment why we called it Mark Zero and not Mark 1. So it's based upon this input notion of feedback. We have hopefully useful information. Teachers generate, we generate hopefully useful information. Fingers crossed, hopefully we'll do some good. It's given or done to receivers, that's the students. So we don't say, would you like some feedback? We just kind of give them, push it. We're pushers of feedback, information. You come here, I'm going to give you feedback whether you like it or not. That's the message we're giving them. So we have these words, this is a common phrase, the lecturer gave feedback to the students. This is a misunderstanding of feedback. You can't give feedback to students. You can give useful information to students which may lead to feedback, but the information is not feedback. And it happens on completion of the work. So this is what we call Mark Zero, and the reason we call it feedback Mark Zero is it ain't feedback at all. It has no feedback effect whatsoever. It's a conventional practice we engage in, and I'm as bad as anyone else. If I'm talking to one of my colleagues in the corridor, I may well say I'm going to give students some feedback today, but that's not what I really mean. What I mean is I'm starting the feedback process through providing them with some information which I'm then going to expect them to do something with. So this is the starting point. And I think it's quite common in almost every level of education, this concept of feedback, unfortunately. And why is it that we've actually left out the key ideas from the disciplines? Because even engineering teachers, when they're teaching engineering, they get it right. As soon as they start to do education, they get it wrong. It's the same concept. How can they get it so wrong? Just they talk to one group this way, another group that way. How odd. Sorry if there are any engineers here. I do like working with engineers, by the way. They've got a real sense of making things work. Okay, so let's look at feedback Mark 1. And feedback Mark 1, don't worry about the diagram at the moment. Feedback Mark 1 is saying, let's pretend we do feedback in education like the way the engineers do it. Okay? And what that means is that we provide some information and we look for an effect, and if the effect is the one we desire, we can then proceed further with that. So if we look at this little diagram here, oops. So we've got this, we've got a course or a course unit or module, whatever you call them. So there's three activities. These could be three activities, three assessment tasks. And the old way of thinking about assessment was, we've got three learning outcomes, they've got three assessment activities. Ah, great. One assessment activity for one learning outcome. Doesn't that match up very nicely? Is there a problem with that? Well, the problem with it is that you then designed feedback out of the system. If every task that you get students to do is about some different outcome, then feedback can't possibly operate. Because there's nowhere for students to take the useful information, apply it to their work, and have it manifest in their future work. So if we were going to follow the engineers, then we'd have 3 activities and there'll be some overlap of learning outcomes. And that overlap will be in really important areas. Key concepts, key skills, things to do with writing, whatever they are. But they would move on, they would be different, obviously. But there'd be some aspect in which we could detect whether what we were inputting to the students made a difference to their learning. We would detect it through seeing improved work. So that's feedback mark 1. Hopefully useful information, it's given, done to the receivers, same as before. It's sequenced to require improvement. So we design our activities so that we can tell there's something that students are doing next when we can tell whether that input had an effect. And importantly, it's given in time for students to improve their work. Now, I don't know whether it's fashionable in the Netherlands, but in Australia it's incredibly fashionable for universities to have rules about the turnaround time, how quickly you've got to return work to students. I see people nodding, so this is a very familiar concept. Do you have these rules too? What would be a typical turnaround time?
3 weeks.
2 weeks?
3 weeks.
3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, yeah, that's the same with us. Think about it. Think about it. Is that a good idea or not? When do the students need the information? They need the information prior to doing the next task. So we need to be thinking about not how long it is since the last task, but how soon before the next one they're getting the useful information. That helps them do something. And sometimes it's got to be quicker than 2 weeks, and sometimes we can be relaxed and it can be a little longer than 2 weeks. I'm not suggesting we sort of sit on, we don't give students the information, we sit on it. But the important measuring thing that we need to look at is the time before the next task, not the time since the last one. Because if the students are going to act on the basis of this useful information, they have to have it in enough time. Which has to be at least a week or 2 before the next task. So, that's feedback mark 1. We solve the problem, don't we? Solve the problem. So all we do is we act like engineers, right? We sequence our activities, we track whether students are actually improving their work, we can go home. No, so people are nodding their heads. Why is it? Why haven't we solved the problem? Well, we have completed some loops, yeah.
But not from the student to the teacher.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And there's something else which is important to point out, is that, I know you'll find this very hard to believe, but students are human beings. They are not inanimate systems. And the fact that they're human beings means that they have volition, they have will, they have intention. They won't necessarily behave in the ways that we guarantee they will behave, in the way that we do for the air conditioning system. For the air conditioning system, it's only a good system if it behaves itself. The light just went off.
Engineering system.
You see, I talk about engineering systems, and I didn't like it. I was criticising them for not being human. So I think there's some animate object in here. There's some spirit of the machine. It's okay for, I think people can hear me in the room, but it must like the recording. Yes. Oh, the inanimate systems come throughout my rescue. So where were we before we were rudely interrupted? Okay, giving time to allow for that. So, problem with feedback mark 1 is that students aren't machines. That's an easy one, we've spotted that. And also, we're not taking into account their own volition. We're not taking the fact that they have motives and ideas of their own. The other problem, of course, is that we as teachers can never spend enough time giving feedback to adjust students' behaviour. See, this temperature measuring thing is on all the time. It never sleeps. And I don't know about you, but I like to sleep from time to time. So we need to think about a feedback mechanism that can be deployed rather more strategically, rather than having a continuous process. So, there's one really, really important thing we can take from feedback mark 1. And that is noticing what the effects are. Without detection of effects, there is no feedback. And it doesn't matter which version of feedback you call it, then we need to think about monitoring effects. So we need feedback to be dialogic, and by dialogic I mean is that students are speaking back. The students actually say something about what they need. So let me pose a very simple question to you. And this will reveal your concept of feedback, in part. When students hand in some work to you, do you also ask them to comment on what kind of comments they would find very helpful from you to them? How many people do that? A few. Good. Congratulations. What you are doing is you're moving feedback in the directions of it being dialogic. Why is it that we assume that we know best all the time? Why is it that we assume that we know exactly what information to give to the students? These students are actually experienced. They've spent years and years in the education system. They know what's useful and what's not useful. And in our survey, when we ask them about things, it's really quite disturbing, some of the things they said. They said, well, why am I keep giving this information that I don't need? And the reason they keep being given information they don't need is because nobody's ever asked them what they would find helpful. So, if you want to take away one simple idea from this morning, the idea is, why don't you ask the students what they would find helpful before you actually give any comments at all? Now what will happen, of course, is the first time you do it, they say, oh, okay, you know best. You just tell me whatever you think is appropriate. No, you've got to challenge that. You can't let that sit. That will happen, and you do need to train the students to actually ask for something useful. But if they don't ask for things that are useful, what on earth have you been doing with them as teachers? Why have you been putting them in this really dependent situation? Why have you been putting them in a situation in which they're not able to ask what they need? It's very odd. So, dialogic, participatory and agentic. This is feedback mark 2. Involves other people. Involves peers, involves the self, involves practitioners. Depends on what the context is. The focus is on change. And it's the focus on change that is driven to a greater or lesser extent by the students themselves. Feedback mark 0, feedback mark 1 was us pushing unsolicited information onto students, hoping that it might have a good effect.
What do you mean with agentic?
Agentic means that the students are agents in the activity, they're not just passive recipients. So in the old notion of feedback is they just receive information. no agency at all. Some students might be agentic, but we've got no way of, we don't design for that. So agentic means students actually have a stake in the process. It involves the development of students' evaluative judgment. And that is their capacity to make judgments about their own work and the work of others. Because after all, excuse me, must be my the long flight that's dried out. Yeah. Yeah, evaluative judgment. There's two things we want students to get from our courses. One is what it says on the tin. What is it we advertise the courses to do? And the courses are there to develop skills in nursing or engineering or whatever it is that you teach. Fair enough, no question about that. But there's something else which is even more important, and that is to develop the capacity in students to judge their own work and that of other people. Because that is the skill that's needed in the workplace, and it's needed in life. It's no good knowing stuff. It's no good being able to do stuff. You need to know what you know, and you need to know what you can do. That is what a competent graduate can do. So we need to focus on that, and we need to focus on that in the feedback space. So, can you read that in the back? It's a bit not very clear. So this would be an example. Please, I've given this example before, and people say this is how you do it. This is not how you do it. This is one of thousands and thousands of ways you can do it. This is just one illustration of how you can do it. So, we had some discussion with the students about the idea of standards of work and what the purposes of feedback are. We then go into the first activity, the first task, the first assignment, whatever. And we start by learners judging their own work. We ask them the question, is this what you hope it will be? We then give that work to someone else. That someone else might be us as a teacher, it might be a peer, it might be a practitioner, and they provide an input about how good that work is. The student then compares judgments, and they produce a plan for improved work. And that plan for improved work, they take into activity 2. So what we're doing is that we're promoting student agency by having the expectation that they judge their own work. And again, the question I want to ask is, why is this not completely commonplace? Why, when we return work to students, do we not say to them, what's your plan for doing something useful with this? That would position it into the space of feedback mark 2. And this is not rocket science. It can be very straightforward. I did a study a few years ago with some colleagues in which we took, for every year of a 3-year degree course, every assignment, every criterion for every standard for every assignment, and got students to make a judgment of their own work before they got any feedback, comments from anyone else. And surprise, surprise, what we found was that students were better able to track, they become more and more effective at making judgments of their own work, because they'd already been put in a position of trying to judge their own work before the feedback information arrived. So the feedback information arrived when they were primed to think about it. When it just appears mysteriously, it's not a good circumstance. So we need to set things up. So, the advertisement. If you want to explore some of the ideas that are not on that website, this occurred out before, this book came out before the website, then you can find that here. But anyway, I'm not into the advertising business. I want to move on to the project that we did. And I mentioned earlier that what we did was that we asked students to nominate the very, very best unit. Do you call them units or courses or modules? Course. So the 3 hours a week for one semester is a course. Is that? We're talking about that size of activity. So we asked students to nominate the good ones, and then we got a list across the 2 universities of which ones were highly regarded, and then we went to them and we did some case studies, and we tried to find out what was good about them. And we then applied some additional criteria of our own. Because we're in the Australian context, we are interested in scale. Okay? We're interested in feedback that works on a large scale. So there was a bias in these case studies towards scale, what you can do in large groups of students. And by large, in the Australian context, is 1,000 plus in a class. That's what we record large. Okay? And I suggest if you can do it with 1,000 plus, you can do much more easily with a smaller group. So several of them were this, and we then went to we put these up on the website. So on the website we have got, this is the list, which was 7, but we went into them in huge depth. So we've got video interviews with teachers involved, where they explain what they were doing and why they were doing it. We've got real hands-on guides for how to do it. We've got references to the ideas. We've got references to the practices, so that if you go into the website, you can actually find a lot of really rich information about how these people were doing things. And we try to cross the different disciplines. There's a bit of a bias towards first year, because our argument is that you've got to get it right in first year, otherwise it's too late. You can do twice as much effort in second year with half the effect. So let's really focus on first year. And that's just the titles. So I'm not going to, you can look at this up. This is the feedbackforlearning.org. You can explore that as you wish. So some of the key points. The thing we need to think about feedback is that in our courses, we treat students the same. And we treat students the same because it's fair, it's equitable. So they have the same learning outcomes, we pursue the same objectives, we provide the same tasks for them, we provide the same assessment activities for them, we have the same criteria that apply to all of their work. And we do this because we mustn't treat students differently, because that would be unfair. But there's a flaw in this argument, and the flaw is students are different. Surprise, surprise. They're not all the same. They didn't all come out of the same box. So we have a few things in our courses that adjust the program to the individual student. And feedback is one of very, very few mechanisms that we have. So feedback is particularly important, in which we adjust everything to meet the needs of individual students, as distinct from treating everyone identically. Second thing is, feedback processes need to be carefully designed, just in the way that hotels need to be carefully designed to stop their guests falling over. The thing is, giving comments to students is only one part of the process. We're not saying that's not important. Don't get me wrong. Don't take that message away. What we say to them is very important. But this is only just one, it's just the tip of the iceberg. You know? Most of the feedback stuff is, below the water. We need active involvement from students, and we need to position students so they're necessarily active. Not the good students are active. That's easy. Right? That's always been the case. The good students, the students that actually don't need any feedback from us, are the ones that benefit most. And there's a number of studies on this. The students that need it most are the ones that benefit least. And we need to complete the loop. If we haven't completed the loop, and the loop is completed by us being able to detect students' improved work, feedback has not occurred. Well, feedback hasn't occurred in Mark 1 and Mark 2. Conventionally, it's occurred. And finally, feedback should be judged in terms of its effect on student learning. Now, one of the things I'm always wary of in sessions like this is that I want to get across the fundamental ideas and the concepts. So I don't regard what I do as tips for teachers, but there's one slide, okay? The next slide is coming up. It's got 10 things that you could do next. And if you take up one or two of these ideas, I suggest that you will markedly improve the quality of the feedback processes in your course. So, I'll let you read them rather than give a commentary. I've mentioned some of them already. Rather than speak to those, I'd like to take questions on those. So if there's one of those that you think, oh, what does that mean, or that looks intriguing, please ask a question about it. It's just like students, you see. Right? You ask students what they would like, and if you don't get it, what you don't do is you don't fill the space by giving them what you'd like to give them anyway. Yes, there's
Thank you. My name is from the University of Twente. I also work a lot in secondary education, and a lot of teachers are concerned about strategy 5 because they're afraid that they won't notice anymore what students have problems with, and also whether students take it seriously. What would you say to those teachers, but also to teachers in higher education who are concerned about it?
What I'd say to that is that I can't comment on high schools because that's not something I'm familiar with. But in higher education, we need peer feedback because there is no way in the world that we can do anything ourselves. The opportunities and the time that we have allocated to do things in the feedback space is far, far too limited for what is needed. So that we need to deploy students in all sorts of roles, and one of the roles is in them giving feedback to each other. Now, there's a misconception about peer feedback. And the big misconception is that the person that benefits most is the person that's on the receiving end of the information. It doesn't work like that. The person that benefits most from peer feedback is the person expressing themselves, because it is a wonderful opportunity for a student to articulate what they know, to formulate it in words that another person can understand, and to respond to that other person when they realise that it isn't communicating effectively to them. So peer feedback has another sort of bonus in higher education. It actually gives students the opportunity to practice what they've learned. And the issue with peer assessment is that, unfortunately, there's been a lot of studies in higher education in which peer feedback has been used to generate student marks. This is very problematic because what we're doing, if we allow students to get marks, is that we're creating a perverse incentive for them to distort their judgments. So we're saying, we don't want you to judge it on its merits. We want you to judge it when there's a big, high-stakes, worthwhile thing that has consequences if you do it this way. So, yeah. So we need to distinguish peer feedback and peer assessment. So there's a question here and then one there.
Could you highlight a bit more on number 8? For the students, in my experience, they are in need for corrections, and as a teacher, and as you indicated, we focus on improvement.
Yeah. The question I want to ask you is, do your corrections lead to improvement? Because typically what happens is that we correct students' work. So, for example, say we're correcting their English, for example. So we focus on the syntax or the spelling or the construction of a sentence or paragraph. What makes us think that that will lead to improved expression in the future? If you have evidence that your corrections lead to improved work, great. But corrections in themselves can too often be backward-looking and can too often give us the sense we're doing something worthwhile, whereas in fact we're not at all. So if you have evidence that your correcting students' work, lead to improved work, great. Otherwise, don't go down that path.
How can I more focus on improvement of the students' work?
Well, the typical things that people do is that they focus on, well, the basic thing is students can't produce good work unless they know what good work looks like. So a very, very powerful influence in getting students to produce good work is them seeing exemplars of good work. Now, I don't mean the one correct exemplar, I mean many different ways of coming to the same outcome. So use of exemplars is a very powerful strategy. So for example, there's a colleague of mine in Edinburgh in Scotland who did this study some years ago now, 10 years ago, in which he had this class in some biological subject, ecology of some kind. And one half of the group, he actually gave detailed comments on their individual assignments in detail. The other group, he didn't give them any direct comments at all. He just gave them exemplars of what the good work is that they should have been doing would look like. He then surveyed the students, and the students said, oh, we really like the detailed comments that you're making on our work. Great, that's a winner. But is it? He then looked at the examinations, and the people that actually had much improved performance were those that he only gave exemplars to. Now, I'm not using this as an argument to say that you never give comments to students about their work. What I'm saying is that we need to be very wary about what assumptions we make, and we must always look to the effect. Always, unrelentingly look to the effect. Is it doing what we hope it will do? Unless we've got evidence of that, and this is evidence that we have to use to convince ourselves. I'm not talking about evidence that we can publish, but we need to be convinced that it does make a difference. So, yeah, there are lots of ways of dealing with this, yes.
How do you then train your students to be feedback literate, like you call it?
Ah, well, that's the next part of my presentation.
Oh, okay.
Before we move on to that, is there any others?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a little bit different question. We often speak about formative assessment. So how do you look at formative assessment? Is it the same as feedback in your story?
Feedback is always formative assessment, yes. Yes,
So
it's an example of it. But there's other forms of formative assessment which are not feedback. Yeah.
Yeah, I am actually teaching in engineering.
Oh, very good. Do you teach feedback?
Yeah, I do actually. I also teach a lot of math, and math is, especially for students, it's quite digital. It's either right or wrong. So when I ask students, what do you want to hear from me? They say, well, I want to hear whether it's right or wrong. Okay, I can give an answer to that, but I already know that that is not helping them as much as I would like that. So what is your advice on the right or wrong?
Well, it's a bit like, do you give students marks? Now, often we're in a situation in which we have to give them marks, we have to give them grades. That's a part of what we do. But the really important thing is not to focus on the marks or grades, but to focus on the really important things. Now, the students think marks, grades are really important, and we have to convince them that they only flow from doing good work. So I never talk to my students about marks and grades. I only talk to them about doing good work and improving their work. If they want to get into a discussion about, you know, one grade or another, I say, well, I'm just not interested. I want to know that you're interested in improving your work. Now, as far as correct answers are concerned, it's a bit like correcting. Right? The important thing is not whether they got the correct answer or not, but did they do the right working? Did they actually approach the problem in the right way? And that's what they need feedback information about, because the next problem they get will have a different answer, of course. But the next problem they have might need to be approached in similar ways that they've been getting wrong. So it's a matter of focusing students' attention on the things that really matter. And we have to convince our students sometimes that what they think is really important, that what is doing them good, isn't actually doing them good at all. Like the Mark Huxton students, they thought by getting detailed comments on their work, they were doing good. They weren't. It was a kind of false consciousness they had about that particular strategy. So we do have to educate students to want things that are worthwhile. This becomes more important as we move through the sequence of the course. So, at the end of semester, feedback information is almost completely worthless, because they're going to move on, they're going to be doing something else next. Unless you've got a really, really tightly sequenced set of courses that build exactly one on the other, then giving students feedback information at the end is worthless. Giving students mark justification early on is okay, but the really important thing they need early on is feedback information. So what you might see over time is an increased emphasis on mark justification and a decreased emphasis on feedback information, because feedback information needs to be front-end loaded early and not at the end. So, for example, when is the time most when you're wasting your time giving students feedback? The end, yeah, just before the exam, right at the end of the course. Right. So don't do it. Okay, justify their marks, that's great. Do that then. That's fair enough. That's a reasonable thing to do. But move the time you were going to spend on giving them feedback information earlier on, when there's still time for them to do something about it. I think we want to take up that point.
Yes, because we waste time by answering general questions. If students have assignments and they want to have feedback, they say, okay, is this all right, teacher? So maybe we have to get them the question more specific. So what's your doubt? What's already good? What's your doubt?
Yes.
So make the question more specific, because that can give lots of less work for the teacher.
Yeah. The more we can train our students to ask for useful things, the greater the chance they actually utilise the information we give them. So I think that's a really important strategy. Yes.
So, looking at point number 9, that giving them examples of good work. I work at social studies, and we always have a discussion about, you know, when you give students like, see someone else work of, we're always a bit afraid if they're going to copy the same strategies, you know, that everybody's taking the same sources of information
Yes.
in the same way to make up their work, you know. We're not having assessments like a multiple choice testing or what a lot of papers they have to turn in. So that's why we don't use them. But what is the argument?
Well, the argument is that you don't give a single example. Exemplars is plural, not singular. So you need multiple illustrations of different people in different situations doing that kind of work. And then you're helping students to identify what it is that they can recognise in the exemplars that is applicable for their particular assignment. So the issue with exemplars is not using them naively. You have to use them in a more sophisticated way, and that is you have multiple exemplars and you get students to interrogate them, and you help students to understand what the exemplars are exemplifying. So that's the thing. So it's not a model answer. Exemplars are not just model answers. And that's very inappropriate in some subjects. In some subjects, model answers are good because, you know, some mathematical subjects they're good, but in examples that you're describing, it's not good. But the problem with practice in some areas is that you need to see multiple examples of practice before you can find your own practice. And that is necessary.
But it's for students, it's also a bit boring to look at all the different papers, because we try that, but you know, they have to work for, like, for example, 5, 6 different papers to find out what the strategies are handled. They don't like to do that.
Well, you just have to make it fun and interesting. I mean, one task that a colleague of mine has been doing, I'm not sure whether he still does it, he's been doing it since the 70s, okay? And he does it in first year classes, and he does it in the very first few weeks of the first year classes. And he gets students into groups, and this could be groups within a huge lecture theatre, it doesn't have to be, you know, small groups. But a group of 5 or 6 students, and he hands out to them 3 examples of something which is very like their next assignment. It's not the same question as their next assignment, but it is the kind of thing that the next assignment would do. And he gets students in those groups to ask the question, is one of these better than another? And of course the answer is yes, because he set it up that way. When one's quite good, one's medium, one's just marginal. But the more important things that he does, the much more important thing he does, is he asks students to identify how can you discern that that one is better than that, is better than that. And what you're doing then is getting students to discriminate between effective and ineffective strategies in an assignment. And then he pushes them further, and then he gets them to identify, if you were going to do an assignment like this, what would be the criteria that you would look for in a really good one? And then, of course, what he's done is set themselves up for the next assignment. In fact, it's their very first assignment in the university. So it's all to do with how you do it. It's not a matter of just kind of handing out examples. So it's the process that makes every difference. It's the same in developing students' judgment. It's exactly how you do it. You don't necessarily have to change the assessment process at all. What you have to change is the bits that go around it. Is it like?
Has this kind of working an impact on the curriculum, the coverage, how much you can handle in your course? Because it takes some time. What do you think about that?
Well, what we know after years and years and years of studies of university courses is that universities are not like wallpaper. Okay? Like we put wallpaper in our house, and the idea is that we cover all the surfaces. And then when all the surfaces are covered, we say, we've done a wonderful job.
Yeah.
Now, the metaphor of wallpaper in a house is not a good metaphor for university courses. So what always happens is that we think we've covered everything, and then we look at what students can do, and there are massive, massive, massive gaps in what students can do. So let's not pretend, let's be honest with ourselves. They're not learning what we're teaching them at the moment. So let's focus on what they really need to know to do well and put more energy into that. And recognise that a lot of what we do is a fantasy. Now, one of the things that we're being urged to do in Australia at the moment is that I've just lost track of my example. Let me get it. Yeah, one of the things that we're required to do at the moment, because we've moved very much further in the direction of learning outcomes than I think you have here, and that our government, in order to maintain the accreditation of all the universities, each university has to identify what the learning outcomes that each course is pursuing, and has to demonstrate that it is assuring the achievement of each learning outcome. And what that means is that if we say something is a learning outcome, we are obligated by law to assess it. And that process has kind of made us realise that what we're doing at the moment is pretend. It's a complete pretense. At the moment, in most examinations, you can compensate by a complete lack of ability to meet some learning outcomes by overachieving on others because they get averaged out. That's complete nonsense. That is not consistent with a standards-based system of higher education at all. So that we need to focus on what are we really going to assess, what are we really going to assess very well, and let's make sure we do that fantastically well and not pretend that we're doing all this coverage of things that we know when we actually do the measurement, nothing happens. Or at least it happens, and then we assess them the following week, and it's all gone. There's nice studies that show that. Okay, shall we move on to feedback literacy? Now, one of the things that arose out of this project that I'm describing is that what we realised was that when we looked at those case studies is that one of the things that they were doing is they weren't just giving students useful information, they were developing students' capacity to actually get information for themselves and utilise it effectively. And this prompted us to think about the notion of what would a feedback literate student look like? So we can do that for, whether you're literate in your own language or not, and the various tests and measurements are doing that. A number of people have talked about assessment literacy. So do students understand how assessment works and how they can utilise it for themselves? And we developed the notion of feedback literacy by analogue with assessment literacy. And David Boud from the University of Hong Kong and myself kind of put out the first paper here on feedback literacy. And we defined it as understanding capabilities and dispositions needed to make sense of information and use it to enhance work or learning strategies. And what we identified in that paper was students need to appreciate the value of feedback and how it works. They need to understand how to make judgments about their own work and the work of others. They need to be able to manage their own affect, and they need to understand processes, and they need to be able to enact processes of taking action. So we did that as a kind of a proposal. So it wasn't empirically based, it was based upon our experience and us being stimulated by being in the feedback literature for some time. what we subsequently did was we took our big survey from the project I described earlier, and we asked ourselves the question, how could learners demonstrate feedback literate behavioural approaches in their courses of study? So we did a secondary analysis of the open-ended questions in our survey, not the closed-ended ones, the open-ended ones. And we did an analysis of the focus groups and interviews that we did for the case studies that I mentioned earlier. And we looked for expressions or indicators of feedback literacy in these open-ended statements. And we then went through an iterative process to identify what you might call a competency framework for feedback literacy. Now, this is something we've only just completed. So what I'm going to describe to you now is in a paper that's been submitted for publication. So, of course, by the time it comes out, the details might be different. This gives you a bit of a flavour of the elements. So we've got, I can't remember how many, 30-something items in this framework. And we took those 4 categories earlier and we expanded them in a lot more detail. So the first one is a group of things to do with students committing themselves to feedback as improvement. And then a feedback literate student will take actions of their own to utilise feedback information for themselves. The second one is about seeing feedback as an active process. So feedback isn't something that gets done to you. Some feedback is something that you have to be a party of. And one of the things we need to do is to shift students, particularly when they first arrive in the university, from this notion of, I'm here, I'm a student, students go and sit in lectures, they kind of do student things, they hang out in student bars. So there's a kind of social identity of student. Okay? And we have to disabuse them. We have to confront them with the fact that they need to develop an identity as a learner, not as a student. And a learner identity is a person that takes action to pursue their own learning. And that is implicit in this framework. So how can they elicit information from other people? How can they prompt feedback information from other people, from the environment? How can they process it? What do they do when they get it? How can they acknowledge and work with the emotions? Because the other dirty little secret of feedback, of course, we haven't talked about the dirty little secret of feedback. The dirty little secret of feedback is that some feedback leads to unlearning. Sometimes, when we give feedback information to students, they know less than before they were given it. And there's a huge literature on this. So let's not think it's a benign process, they just ignore it. Sometimes students actually take notice of it and it leads them astray. So we need to think about the affective dimension of it here. Seeing feedback as a reciprocal process is like, you know, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. So this is about the peer dimensions of it. And then about enacting.
Is number 6 peer-to-peer, or is it also,
no.
Does it also apply to professors?
No, sorry, which number was that?
6.
6.
Reciprocity between students and professors would be nice too, wouldn't it?
Well, it would be nice too, yes. Yes, I agree with you.
Because you talk about handing in work, but that doesn't activate students, right?
Yeah, see, one of the strange things about feedback at the moment is that the person that's least able to learn from it is us.
Right.
Right. Because how come, year after year after year, we give information to students which is accurate, true, and there's no effect whatsoever.
Give feedback, it's weird.
Yeah, yeah.
They should ask for feedback.
Yeah.
And you
but no. This is the old paradigm. The old paradigm is you then do another survey. There's been endless surveys of students' opinions about our feedback and so on and so forth. We need to move beyond that when we need to actually utilise the information that's already there. For example, the most powerful commentary on our teaching is students' performance in assessment. How often do we analyse student performance and assessment in the light of how we're going to change our teaching. What we do instead is we have all these silly surveys that ask all these abstract questions, and we have great difficulty interpreting what they mean. Whereas in the assignments that students produce from us, they're telling us every single day what we need to do about our teaching. So yes, it is a reciprocal process from that as well. We didn't do it in this context because the data was drawn from these students, not from staff. So that's my excuse and I'm sticking with it. I'm not going to go through all of these, I'm just going to put a few up. I was going to edit these slides last night before I had my accident intervened, so that there are rather more slides than are necessary up here. So this is the first one about committing feedback. Commits to feedback as improvement. That's just a quote. This is the second section, and I'll let you read that.
Do we need to help them as teachers to become this?
That's what we're coming on to. Yes. Yes. I'll just give you an opportunity to see what they are. Yeah. The question is why not?
Yeah, I think we need to help them.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm not going to go through every one because it's boring. It's just look at lots of slides. So I'm going to jump ahead to this one. You can look at the version that Mark has up on the website. Okay, so we've got this framework. What do we do with it? One of the obvious things about what we do with it is that it can help us plan what kind of strategies we need to introduce in our courses. Now, this framework is a framework for the most sophisticated student. Okay? So we're not expecting the first year student to have met all those outcomes. But the question is, why, by the end of the course, if they haven't got all of these, should we be graduating them, for example? So where are some of these going to sit? So there's a big question about which of these we pursue and where do we pursue it? In what courses do we pursue it? And again, we need to front-end load first year, particularly with regard to student agency and getting them much more agentic and much more active in the process of feedback. So it's all about the second one here, about positioning students as active. We can't achieve this if we are creating dependent students. If students just sit in our lectures, they take notes, and then they produce something in tests and evaluations, forget about this. You're not interested in that. That's our different world. But if you are interested in developing the students' capacity to be more effective learners, then we need to find ways of incorporating this in our courses. One of the questions, of course, that we want to ask ourselves is why can some students benefit a lot from feedback and others not at all? And we're starting to come to the very tentative conclusion that our present practices are very, very good at helping the people that least need our help. So how do we actually shift that? It's helping good students become even better, and it's doing absolutely nothing for the weaker students. Now, one of the things that we're doing right now is that in collaboration with a colleague in Hong Kong, not David Carlos, but a colleague in another Hong Kong university, Yangtze, we're developing an instrument to measure feedback literacy. And we're doing this in a rather bold way because we're interested in developing an instrument, it might have different versions, that can work all the way through from primary, secondary, higher education and workforce feedback. Now, we're going to have to adjust the items a little bit on the way through, but we're interested in mapping the changes in feedback literacy over that very long period of time, because we're expecting that students to get more and more sophisticated at doing this. And of course, if you look at some of the things that go on in primary and secondary schools, they're actually picking up and running with some of these things. It's higher education where we're a bit slow. So we're developing this instrument to track feedback literacy over time and to evaluate strategies that are helpful in developing that in students. I'm just going to finish off now and then we can have more questions. So some of the challenges for feedback literacy development that we've identified is we need to see feedback as the business of learners. And if it's the business of learners, we need to help them with that process. We've got to shift the perspective of teachers from information providers to facilitators of learner feedback literacy. That's an emphasis over time. We need to work with affect. And there's a lot of really, really awful research. Not awful in bad research, awful in terms of disturbing research about emotions and feedback. And it leads in some disciplines to awful things like the feedback sandwich. How many of you are familiar with the feedback sandwich? Yeah. I bet you're from the health disciplines. Yeah, the health disciplines love the feedback sandwich. So the thing about the feedback sandwich is you say something really nice to students about their work, then you slip in the nasty bit in the middle, and then you end off with something really, really nice. There is no empirical base for the feedback sandwich whatsoever. None whatsoever. And often what happens is students take away what they like to hear. Oh, this person said really nice things about my work. They missed the bit in the middle. So we need to think that, and the reason the feedback sandwich was established was in order to manage emotional responses from students. Basically, so students didn't kick up a fuss when we were giving them face-to-face feedback. But that's not often said. So, and also finally, to come back to the design, feedback is something that needs to be designed. Feedback doesn't occur. We've come from this tradition in which feedback is something we do as an afterthought after we've given students an assignment. They've got an assignment. We better give them some feedback. And what that does is it positions feedback as the lowest issue on the hierarchy of things that we need to worry about. I want to suggest that we actually need to design feedback into our courses right up front. And some of that feedback will be associated with graded tasks. Some of it will be associated with tasks which are not graded. And some of it will be a part of the natural, normal, everyday interactions in classes. So it's not necessary to associate it with graded tasks. We need to disaggregate, disentangle those two ideas. So, conclusions. So, to improve feedback, we need to develop students' skills in understanding processes of feedback. If feedback literacy is important, we need to be able to recognise it, operationalise it, and work out how to build it. Students can become more feedback literate, but the foundations for that need to be done up front. So there's a really radical, important emphasis on first year classes. And of course some aspects of feedback literacy are more difficult to achieve than others. And we need to think about how we sequence things. An important part of feedback design is the sequence of things. Are we sequencing things that make sense? Are students moving from one thing to another in a way that they can build their capacity to do later tasks more effectively? So I think at that stage I will pause, and that will give us time for a few more general questions. Yes?
It's about your last comment. Can you give some tips about literature to find out more about the sequences. Because that sequence, I don't know what best is to start with, what is more difficult for our students. So I want to find out more about it.
Well, one of the things I think we need to think about again is, do we have all these one-off assessment tasks that have got no relationship to other assessment tasks? One strategy that people have used is to have a kind of a continuously building assessment over a semester, so that each part of it feeds into the next part of it, so that the whole thing is nested, so that by the time they get to the end, they've actually built their capacity to do various things along the way. Other people are using getting feedback on drafts. So when students hand in a draft, they get comments about the draft, and then you can see the effect later on. So there's lots of sequencing strategies that we can use.
And do you describe them in the book you are having?
Yeah, the book's got some examples of strategies.
Thank you.
I'm here from the Nijmegen University. I was wondering, one way of learning is role modeling. This is one way of role modeling. How good are we as teachers in asking for feedback and receiving feedback? And do you have ideas maybe how to emphasize that a little bit more?
I think we've probably guessed my view on some of this. My view is that we've placed too much emphasis on surveys and not enough emphasis on using the information that's sitting right in front of us. So, for example, in terms of teachers modelling, I think teachers need to show how they do tasks. And they don't show how they do tasks by having one I prepared earlier that's got all the right answers in it. Right? That's unproblematic. We need to show our students the difficulties of grappling with a difficult problem, so that they might be able to identify how they can grapple with difficult problems themselves. Last question. Yes?
Is there any research that investigates whether introducing proper feedback will increase study success?
There is, but it's actually rather patchy. It's not complete. And in fact, the book that we've just given to the publishers is focusing on looking for the impacts of feedback. So we're exploring that in the next book, which is coming out with Palgrave Macmillan. And the first author is Michael Henderson, first editor. There's the three of us. I'm involved, Rolo Jar is involved, and Liz Malloy is involved. So look out for that. It should be out by the end of the year. So I think I should wrap up this session now. Thank you very much for your very interesting and informative questions. And go and do really good feedback.